Well, good morning, everybody. Welcome. Very sunny morning where I am. I hope it's sunny where you are. I'd like to extend a warm welcome on behalf of Keating Chambers, Create Streets and Pinsent Masons to this morning's webinar on building beautiful and design coding, new changes to the MPPF. I can see from my screen that numbers are going up rapidly. So I shall just fill a little bit of time as people join the webinar. But as we're now sort of firmly getting into three figures, I think we'll make a start. So very warm welcome from all of us. Fundamentally important issue that we're going to be discussing today: the enshrining of beauty in the planning system. Not, I think it's fair to say, happy bedfellows for a number of years. It's a really, really important discussion that we're going to be having today with three absolutely fantastic speakers and experts in this area. The format for the session will be three presentations. We've got a few slides to share with you. Then at the end of the presentations, there will be a Q&A. Please post questions in the Q&A box as we go through. And my job will be to take as many of those questions as we can at the end, and our panelists will be really pleased to help answer those questions. We're going to try and limit the session to about an hour, but obviously there's a lot to get through, but we'll keep an eye on time. Our speakers probably will speak for half an hour, 40 minutes, which should leave a good 20 minutes for questions at the end. So please don't be shy. This is very much a discussion and very much looking forward to hearing your views on how the planning system can accommodate some of the challenges that we're going to be running through with you today. And we have got an absolutely top panel of experts this morning. I mean, none of them need introduction, but I do have to introduce them. Nicholas Boyce-Smith is the founding director of Create Streets, an independent research institute that encourages the creation of more and better urban homes, terrace streets of houses and apartments rather than complex multi-storey buildings, and is supporting the current wave of reform to the planning system to make it more responsive to what people like in the built environment. Nicholas was a member of both the UK's Government Design Review Panel and the Estate Regeneration Panel chaired by Michael Heseltine. He's a Commissioner of Historic England, a Senior Research Fellow at the University of Buckingham, and a Senior Member of the Academy of Urbanism. So nobody, frankly, better placed to take us through the evolution of building better, building beautiful, and design coding and design guidelines. So I'm very much looking forward to what Nicholas has to say in a few moments. Our second speaker this morning is Clare Mirfin. Clare is a legal director with Pinsent Masons based in our London Planning and Environment team, and she specialises in development planning, advising developers and local authorities on major development, including large-scale regen schemes, strategic land promotion, mixed use, and contentious matters, including appeals and judicial reviews. Recent highlights for Clare include advising the Wellcome Trust on their Genome Campus project in Cambridge, advising Lend-Lease on the delivery of their housing-led regen scheme Elephant Park, and Croydon Council on its town centre regeneration proposals, including the refurbishment of the Fairfield Halls. So Clare's going to take us through the policy changes in the MPPF and how those are going to filter through and be interpreted by the planning system. So looking forward to that, Clare. Charles Banner. Charles Banner doesn't need an introduction, but here we go. One of the leading planning barristers of his generation with a broad planning, public law, European law, procurement law practice. When he's not practicing law and furthering his international television career as one of the highest rated shows on TV, Have We Got Planning News for You, Charles somehow finds time to be a part-time justice at the Astana International Finance Centre Court, Deputy Chair of the Joint Nature Conservation Committee, and an independent member of the Global Standards and Regulation Board of the RICS. And he's also a father to two small, lively children. And Charles is going to spend some time thinking about how this plays through the local plan making process in the context of the headline proposals in the white paper relating to growth areas, etc. also how this theme will pervade neighbourhood planning and the much heralded fast track for beauty. So again, a really, really timely and useful presentation from Charles. So just before I hand over to Nicholas, I just wanted to share a few very brief thoughts, which I'm going to try and put on the screen now. So just bear with me while I do that. Hopefully you can see a little slide on your screens. It's the challenge is making the slide move on. It's probably slightly cliched, but it's difficult to talk about this subject without quoting a bit of Ruskin. And this one of my favourite quotes. And really, this is the challenge. I think for at least the last decade and probably longer, the planning system has been focused on delivery. And indeed, many of the agencies and public bodies involved in planning and housing have been focused perhaps obsessively on delivery. It's been the entreaty of successive governments and is certainly at the heart of what Homes England is trying to achieve as the main public sector body tasked with funding and delivering homes in England. But we mustn't lose sight of the need for this to be a generation of house building that we're not embarrassed about or ashamed of in the future. So not a new theme. This is Ruskin back in the 19th century, but certainly a theme that the planning system needs to tackle at the moment. Some thoughts, I suppose, just to kind of start the debate. I think it's going to be difficult to enshrine beauty in the planning system in a legal way. That's certainly what the government's expecting to see, and Clare will examine that. Defining beauty objectively is also a significant challenge for the planning system for obvious reasons, and that's going to lead, I think, to tension and inconsistency between the various levels of policy and guidance, which again Clare will, I think, unpack for us this morning. One of the pervading themes that gets mentioned in this context is the resource implications in relation to making this work, both in terms of promoting the local guides and funding the required empirical research, not just for local authorities, I think also for local communities as well. Will this embolden local communities, or will they feel ill-equipped to deal with it? But also, frankly, promoters and developers. There's a big challenge here around resource, and Nicholas may be able to help on this, but I'm not sure that we're necessarily convinced that the resource is going to be there to help upskill and support, particularly local authorities, as this becomes a more important issue. And inevitably, there's going to be growing pains as we transition into this new system. And again, I think Clare and Charlie will identify where we expect there to be some tensions and inevitably planning appeals and legal challenges. And we'll do our best to perhaps find some middle ground there to steer us through with as little challenge as possible. Right, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and hopefully I'm now going to hand over to Nicholas, who's going to explain what this is all about. Nicholas, over to you.
It's always a dangerous dangerous thing. Explain what it's all about. Thank you, Ian. While you were introducing me earlier, but Mike, you turned into R2-D2 for a bit, and all I heard that you thought about me was a series of sort of tweeps and whistles for 30 seconds. So I hope it was nice, and I hope it wasn't over generous, because I'll be a big disappointment if so. Let me pull up my screen. What I'm planning to do is to talk. Hopefully you can all see that. Ian or Clare or Charlie, say if not. Hang on. Hopefully that's come up. What I propose to do is talk you through some of the thinking behind and some of the work behind some of the activity that's happened on what you might call the design agenda, the beauty agenda over the last few years. I'm not going to focus on the white paper, because I think Charlie and Clare will talk with far more legal expertise on that than I will. But I thought I'd just sort of talk you through, to some degree, what's happened and my view on what's happened, probably with a focus on the Building Better, Building Beautiful Commission report that reported what now seems like a lifetime ago in January of last year. The first thing actually that just came out and that is worth being aware of is the new National Design Guide that was actually published in October of 2019. I think to some degree superseded by the National Design Code that came out a couple of months ago, which I'll come to. But I think it's just worth being aware of the framework for a well-designed place, which you can see in the right-hand side, bottom right-hand side of the screen, is the framework that has been picked up in the National Design Code. So some of the thinking there, has carried on. I think there were quite a few people, certainly myself included, who were of the view that though helpful, not unhelpful, it didn't really cut to the chase in actually increasing the focus that local councils or landowners or developers would feel they needed. And I think the fact there's not much talked about probably goes to that point. I guess the second thing that has happened over the last few years was the report of the Building Better, Building Beautiful Commission. What I thought and hope would be helpful would be if I just talk for a few minutes about some of the thinking that went into that and why and how. It was a broadly brushed piece of work. I co-chaired it latterly with Roger Scruton, the late Roger Scruton, series of commissioners, series of advisors, many meetings, 2 calls for evidence, series of 8 working groups looking at some of the policy areas in detail, including planning, and then visits all around the country. The context, and this I think goes to Iain's point, the context was that this is about more than just the need for new homes. Also the need to be carbon neutral, the increasing perception that poverty has regional or lack of prosperity has regional patterns in this country that have now been endemic for many years, the need to try and end that. And I think also the growing realization brought very much into sharp focus by the events of the last year that we do need to worry far more about mental health and well-being, and that one can be rich without being happy, and that we do need to think about both. Iain had a good quote from Ruskin. How about this as a quote? New places are designed by the wheelie bin operators. That really strikes home. I think many people will recognise that. I've actually just brought up another one while you were talking. This is I can't say who, but a very senior executive in the house building industry, being admirably frank. Some house builders believe they can build any old crap and still sell it. Well, I think it'd be nice to end that. As some of you will recall, the inception of the Building Better, Building Beautiful Commission was quite controversial. There was a lot of criticism from the design industry, but I think actually as we did our work, and then as we reported first in the interim report and then in the final report, actually we got a very warm welcome. Civic Voice, people up and down the country got in touch with us as we were working. You can see some of the quotes on the page here, basically saying thank you. And this perhaps partly goes to one of Iain's points. Certainly I'm aware of, both from the report process and subsequently, of many local communities actually feeling emboldened to talk about this, and that they're not just being foolish, and they're very much not, because where we live, as I'll come to later, has a measurable quality on our quality of life. So a warm welcome to our report. RTPI and Civic Voice did various polls. You can see the numbers here, warmly welcoming our work. We defined beauty at 3 levels of scale. And I think this is perhaps the sort of first point to take away. If this is of interest, I hope it is. One, if you like, is the building, the quality of the facade, the quality of how it fits into its immediate place. The second is the place, streets, squares, parks, enclosure ratios, level of materiality, and then also is location, how placed a new settlement or an extension to existing settlement is in the landscape, and the nature of the life, excuse me, the nature of the life that you can lead living there. Whether you can live sustainably, to what degree sustainable other transport options can be available to you. I think the first point I'd make is that we can and do create what most people would regard as beautiful places today. His Goldsmith Street in Norwich, Savoy Circus in London, the Wintles in Shropshire, the Bourne Estate and Nanslead in Cornwall. However, too often we don't, and the public, we discovered, sees the planning system essentially as a shield, as a backward-looking thing against modernity, rather than as a sword to argue for better things in the future. Now, contractually, I remember this, in order to use this picture, I'm not allowed to make any comment about it, so I will let it speak for itself. But development can be a cause of ugliness, but can also be a cause of great beauty and improvement to places. And we want to go back, I think, ultimately to thinking of planning as a sword rather than as a shield. Now, underpinning, I think, the report and the work we did are 3 key insights. The first is that, insanely, perversely, we're actually creating less good places than we used to in the past. Lots of reasons for that. One is technological. We can create huge, great sheds, or indeed huge ugly buildings, or even small ugly buildings, incredibly cheaply in a way that we just couldn't before. The second is I think a fundamental confusion about the role of the motor car. I mean, we've confused the freedom, the liberty that the motor car created in, if you like, a 1930s country road with how we should run our towns and cities. I think also, I just remember what I was going to say here. What was I going to say there? And I think also we've we've failed to understand. The second insight is that at the population level rather than individual level, the idea that design is subjective is a dangerous myth. What people like, where they want to be, the relationship between place and health is increasingly predictable. And where we live, how many neighbours we know, how tense we feel on the quotidian journey, to work or school, is very much a function of where we live. About 40% of our health outcomes are a function of where we live rather than who we are. And design affects us from the clarity of the block pattern associated with low crime, the level of symmetry in the built environment, colour, coherent complexity, some symmetry, some texture, and places where it feels easy and safe to walk are all associated with knowing more of our neighbours, feeling safer as we go from to work to school, and feeling happy about not just where we live but our overall lives. And we made a case in the report for gentle density, which I think has most of the evidence, perhaps all the evidence would suggest, combines the advantages of propinquity, being closer to neighbours, being able to easily get to work or to school or to combine trips, using cars less, but also the advantages of personal space. And the most consistent data in all the pricing studies we've ever looked at or indeed done ourselves shows that we all do want personal space and personal green space. It's not time to go through all the research now, but let me just sort of cite one study, which I think is just nicely telling. This is a famous study from the 1970s. It's recently been replicated in Bristol. Those three streets are differently trafficked, and the coloured lines represent friendship patterns. The red street on the left is heavily trafficked. The blue street on the right is lightly trafficked, and you can see the profound difference in the number of neighbours that people know. And knowing neighbours, as long as you're not forced to speak to them when you don't want to, again, is reliably and consistently associated with greater happiness. Again, not just with the place you live in, but indeed of life more generally. The second, I think, key insight we tried to share with government was that regulating urban form and design and development is not new. I mean, very crudely, if you like, if there's a right-wing view on planning, is that evil Mr. Attlee created in the 1940s, and very crudely, if there's a left-wing view, it's that nice Mr. Attlee created in the 1940s. They are both profoundly wrong. I mean, I'm slightly satirising them. Regulating what we build in the built environment goes right to the core of what towns and cities and the state does. This is a city in the Indus Valley. There's very clear evidence of some sort of regulation of block pattern and development patterns. Here's a much more recent example from the 18th century, a second grade house influenced by the 1774 Building Act, which in itself followed a series of legislation earlier in the 18th century and the 1667 Act after the Great Fire, and a series of similar regulations with varying degrees or stipulations, sometimes by powerful local landowners, did similar things in many towns and cities up and down the country. You could, I think, very credibly argue, no, I think it's unarguable, in fact, that 18th century London was more regulated in what you could build than modern London is. Maybe that's a good thing, maybe that's a bad thing, but this isn't new. But that then, I think, asks the question, if we're going to regulate here, what should we do? If there's going to be a role for the state, it's clearly got to be associated with, and hopefully this is going to move forward. Sorry, this is overly animated. Let's just get through that. So these were the recommendations we made. You'll be relieved to know, go through all of them. I'll focus probably mostly on planning. I'd probably pick out three key areas that we touched on. One was planning and levelling the playing field. I'll come back to that. Second was stewardship, incentivising responsibility of the future. And then the third probably is management and the incentives that elements of the public sector particularly are under in the approach they bring to the places we create and how they think about that. It's not to say the other things aren't important, but to some degree they link to those. So on planning, I mean, and again, Iain touched on this. The first is that we should enshrine beauty as a systemic and strategic aim of the planning system. That's not to say, and I know I'm not going to get into this because Clare and Charlie will do it with far more expertise, that we should be defining what beauty means in every single individual building nationally. That would clearly be foolish. But in the way that sustainable development is set as an aim of what we're trying to achieve as society, the idea of beauty, living a good life, connected, feeling purposeful in a beautiful place, should be what we are trying to achieve. And if we're not trying to achieve that, and by the way, the planning system used to try and do that. If you look at some of the preambles to regulation in the 1930s or earlier, or in the work that the National Trust, Octavia Hill did, that seemed absolutely obvious. But we've sort of lost that confidence over the course of the last 50 or 60 years. Secondly, and this has already been picked up, that we should expect net gain from development, that it should be made easier to say no to buildings that are regarded as ugly. But crucially, and we'll come back to this, that what that means needs to be discovered locally. And we made a strong argument for form-based codes as a way to visualize and localize and allow people to understand that. I'll probably move on from there. Just one point, and I talk about the planning system with lawyers on the line very nervously, but here we go. So as part of our work for this, and indeed in previous work I've done, we looked at how the regulation of what we build works in different countries. Plans in this country are far less, you can see it in red at the bottom, are far less binding. They are less regulatory and more policy-based in most countries. In most countries, it's far clearer what you can and can't build most of the time in most places. And that has consequences, because as developers on the call will know, the money that you need to spend before you've got planning permission is the hardest money to raise and the highest cost of capital. It is not surprising that we have, I think by any measure, the most concentrated development market in the world, certainly in the Western world, and that essentially the competition takes place on access to land rather than, if you like, on the quality of what you build. So we made a strong case, and we can come back to this, on visualizing local plans, or having them more map-based, more visual, come back to the community impact into that. We certainly made a case against PD as it's currently working with essentially no standards. While we were working on just afterwards, the government, I think, rightfully brought in requirements on on windows and on minimum space. Very welcome. This is the famous development in Watford that I'm sure you know, where the planning inspector, whilst conceding that it's not a positive living environment, which I don't think we need to argue about, nevertheless couldn't stop it. Well, that's clearly not acceptable. So if we, I think there's a case to be saying some things don't need full planning permission, but clearly very clear standards have to apply to that. Second key theme, I hope this is still of interest. I've only got another 2 hours, don't worry. Second key theme is bringing the democracy forward. Now, the exciting thing here is this is getting easier to do, not just through sort of co-design thing that we run, but actually by engaging wide as well as deep. I've looked at so many local plans which are almost impossible to understand, even if you're reasonably technically competent, very unclear. It's not clear what will get built where in consequence. It's getting easier and cheaper to engage digitally, to use CGI, to look at alternative views of the future. Neither of these buildings exist, but they're the same internally other than movement of the windows. Perfectly possible to poll on this type of thing, perfectly possible to start understanding how people feel they would like their part of the world to develop and change. And by the way, that was one, I should have said this earlier, that's one of the key themes that came up in so much of the spontaneous and requested feedback we got during the commission, was that people feel development's being done at them, that it doesn't fit in, they don't like it, and it's destroying the spirit of place. Only last Easter evening, I was sitting in on a workshop one of my team was running in Yorkshire, where that theme again was coming up very clearly from what people feel is happening to their valley in Yorkshire. They're not against development. I know lots of people think NIMBYs are always against development. They're not. They just don't like what's happening or the way in which it fits in, or the way indeed it's being done. Third key theme is stewardship. I won't touch on this so much, but it is incredibly important. It's one the government has not yet, I think, really picked up on. So we suggested a stewardship kite mark. We suggested access to a patient capital fund linked to Homes England. And then crucially, and there's no movement on this yet, that there needs to be a level tax playing field on income tax versus capital gains tax. As I'm sure many of you know, landowners are currently incentivized essentially to sell it quickly so it doesn't turn into to sell it quickly so it does turn into capital receipt and doesn't turn into income over time. That essentially makes it harder to do land pooling and makes it harder for landowners to take a long-term view on their land, as landowning developers used to do for many hundreds of years. And we need to get back to landowners being, at the very least, neutral on taking a long-term view rather than being incentivized to just sell it and sod off. That's critically important, and no movement on that yet. We suggested a Minister for Place, a chief placemaker in all local authorities, aligning tax for existing and new places through VAT alignment, recycling of buildings, resilient high streets, and that one I'll pick up on, but banishing box land. The idea, if we think about the greenery of buildings, clearly there's a lot of discussion about energy usage, quite rightly. We do need to think about sustainability in the built environment, I think at 3 levels of scale. It's not just the building, come back to those 3 levels of scale, and its energy efficiency. It's also the lives we lead around that building. Different urban morphologies have different relationships with how much we walk or how inclined we are to open the windows, but also how long buildings will survive. This building has got marvelous embodied carbon. It's 800 years old. This shed, no one is going to recycle this. So we are essentially, we're wasting carbon by creating buildings that have such a taut time frame. This horror was recycled into this. This should be increasingly how we're thinking about our built environment. And this isn't the future. This should be the future. An environment in which we can walk and talk and know our neighbours, not need to drive everywhere. Boxland, and this is a project which Chris Streets did, needs to be reinvented. Ending the bias against gentle density. There are lots of some elements in building codes, and more prominently often issues in local plans about parking standards or back-to-back distances, or oddly interpreted light standards that make it very hard to do the type of gently, finely grained density that actually many of our towns, which are the most popular areas in many of our towns and cities. I got into a lot of this actually by realizing how unbuildable most of the most valuable and popular bits of London were, including my own house and the street I live on. I'm going to just move on quickly. We made a strong plea for urban greenery, planting street trees, encouraging developers to think of 1 fruit tree per house, and made various practical suggestions on regreening streets and squares. I'll jump over education, just come to management, and I'll be done in a couple of minutes. And again, I think a key area here was that we talked about digital planning here, but also that the KPIs and the metrics for Homes England at the strategic level, but also for the decisions that they make in terms of selling land, in terms of where land goes, need to reflect quality, and a provably popular quality, as well as price. And also a strong plea for rediscovering civic pride in architecture. If you look at the quality of the civic buildings we built 50 or 100 years ago to the sheds we have built over the last 2 generations, it is embarrassing for us as a society. People don't like it. We need to reclaim our pride in the types of places we create. Overall, we tried to make a case for moving from a vicious circle of parasitic development with unclear quality asks, low support for development, low political ability to create new homes in places, insufficient new homes, and then thus high land prices, and back we go, to a virtuous circle of regenerative development where there are clear quality asks. We hope over time more support for development, more sense of agency in design places happening because locals are influencing what quality means, it's not imposed on them, and some degree of speculation removed from land prices, so there's a clearer quality bar. I'll jump over that. The launch, now seems like a lifetime ago, just not that long over a year ago, but I think we did get strong support. We got strong support from the Secretary of State and from the government. Perhaps more to people's surprise, we also got broader support from the design and development industries. I think the chairman of Redrep was quite rude about it, but other than that, we got pretty ubiquitous support. The Academy of Urbanism, architects, TCPA, and the YIMBY Alliance. So I think we feel and hope we were doing something right in pulling together that broad coalition, and public philosophers as well. And Alan de Botton and Roger Scruton had not always agreed with each other, so that was, I think, very comforting that we were able to get that broad coalition. Right, that's enough on that, I promise. I'm going to jump over the white paper because Clare and Charlie are going to talk to that. I'll just make a couple of quick more points and then I will stop. Changes to the NPPF announced at the end of January, and indeed the government's formal response to Living with Beauty exactly a year after we published. Obviously, a lot had been picked up in the white paper. I mean, we were pretty pleased with the response. I think the former commissioners, there were differences in wording, but most, with one exception of the requests we suggested for the planning system, were picked up in the NPPF. And obviously, there's a lot more to do going forward. Publication of the National Model Design Code, which I have to say I think is an excellent piece of work, and I think full marks to the team at MHLG and to Urbed who did it. And I think it's just worth pointing out that the National Model Design Code is not a code, and nor is it meant to be. It's a process for creating one and stipulations and suggestions as to what should be in there. Interestingly, talking to local councils and to some neighbourhood forums and parish councils over the last couple of months, I'm detecting certainly, though there is some nervousness, there's a lot of hope as well, as that it's going to be easier to set out clearly and visually what good means round here. So I hope we can get a more level playing field for more people developing. As some of you may know, at the end of January, the government also announced that it would be creating an office for place to help support the implementation of the new system. I'm not going to say much about that because I'm actually chairing the transition board, but the aims are very much to support via good research, councils and community groups in going forward with this and helping create better places, and some pilots which are being announced shortly. And just worth flagging up as well, just in case you don't know this, I think it's probably less well known. This is very important. This is something we mentioned quite prominent in the Living with Beauty report. Manual for Streets 3 is coming. I hope that it will have policy rather than guidance power. Manual for Streets 1 and 2 are excellent documents. They have far too little influence. There still continue to be many councils, particularly at county level, who rely on DB32, even though that's exactly the problem. It has been withdrawn. People still refer to it. I heard it referred to in a meeting only 2 days ago. This hopefully will plug in intimately to the National Design Code and indeed to the work of the Office for Place. Also worth mentioning, and again, I think little talked about, announced last year, Active Travel England, with a serious budget, a new statutory consultee for the planning system, and a real focus on encouraging walking and cycling. So hopefully, I think that's it. I'll stop share there. Hopefully that's a good canter through, not too much detail. And I think it's back to Iain now. Thank you very much for listening.
Fantastic, Nicholas. Thank you. You covered so much ground in not very much time. Massively encouraged by that, actually. I mean, some of the images that you flashed up, local authorities and good design team members working with local communities to deliver high quality places. So this is possible. This is the art of the possible, which is fantastic to see. Beauty isn't subjective. It's interesting as you start to go through those examples of symmetry and good design, it starts to become clearer, Nicholas, as to why beauty doesn't have to be completely subjective, and that regulation, in a sense, isn't to be feared. So absolutely fantastic. Thank you very much for that. Questions are starting to come in. I've got a note of those, and certainly we'll be saving those up for after our next speakers. So Clare, you're going to take us through the policy changes and how you see law and policy and regulation interacting. So over to you.
Thank you very much, Iain. Now I'm just going to see if I can work out how to share my screen so that you can see my slides. Are those now visible? I'm going to take that.
They are.
Thank you. I was going to take that as a yes based on the silence. So thank you very much. And it was a fascinating introduction from Nicholas, which I will follow in much drier terms as I seek to have a look at what the consultation that the government has recently announced is seeking to do. So here we are. If you go onto the MHCLG website, this is the consultation announcement. A quick reminder, the timing of this seminar or webinar is not by accident. You've got until 11:45 p.m. on Friday night should you want to respond. So what is the consultation doing? It's looking at the draft revisions to the National Planning Policy Framework, and it's actually unusually for the government consulting on what it said will be guidance in the form of the draft National Model Design Code. And why is the government consulting? Well, principally it's to respond to the Building Better, Building Beautiful report, Living with Beauty, and the changes that are being picked up initially from that through the NPPF. There are some other changes to the NPPF not linked to that report. I'm not going to focus on those particularly. And also to seek views on the National Model Design Code, which has been produced to help local authorities try and identify and work up design codes and guides and policies for themselves in order to promote successful design within their areas. Flicking on. So as Nicholas has already said, the Building Better, Building Beautiful Commission identified 3 key aims for reforming the planning and development process, or to take forward in the planning and development process. The first is ask for beauty, the second was to refuse ugliness, and the third is to promote stewardship. Building on that, I'd like to call it the B4C, as Nicholas said, that was how you were allowed to say it, and it's quicker, identified 45 policy propositions under 8 key themes. And the first of those was to create a predictable level playing field, whereby beautiful placemaking is enshrined as a fundamental aim of the planning system. So as you can see, I thought it was worth taking that quote from the B4C Living with Beauty report. And the centre section of underlining is probably the focus of this current consultation. So the sort of beautiful placemaking approach should be embedded prominently as a part of sustainable development in the national planning policy framework and associated guidance. Nicholas also touched on sort of the difference between planning in England versus planning in Europe, noting that the UK system is not as predictable as other countries. I mean, that comes more through the white paper themes on looking at the three areas for growth, renewal and protection that I think Charlie will speak about in due course. So here we are, we've got the government's positive response to the report. They've accepted the Commission's recommendation for a stronger focus on beauty in national planning policy, and that there is a compelling case for more certainty about design principles through the publication of the National Model Design Code. That's a predictable level playing field. And as you can see, the ball will go straight to the back of the net. I think this is a suggestion of the success that may come through trying to get better placemaking through the identity of beauty at a national and a local scale in policy and guidance terms. So what's happened to the MPPF? I've tried to basically I started sort of setting out every single change and realized there was far too much to cover in 10 minutes. So I've summarized the changes here by paragraph in response, and how they've come forward in response to some of those key policy propositions identified in Living with Beauty. The majority of the MPPF changes are unsurprisingly focused on that first key theme of creating a predictable level playing field, and are concentrated in chapter 12 of the MPPF, which addresses achieving well-designed places. But they're not limited to that chapter of the MPPF. They're also in chapter 3 in the strategic policies on plan making, as you might expect, chapter 5 on delivering a sufficient supply of homes. And then interestingly, in chapters 9 and 15, 9 is promoting sustainable transport, and that picks up Nicholas's point about the manual for streets. You'll see a subtle deletion in footnote 45, and that says that the manual for streets will be updated, but the current guidance should no longer be referred to, and that theme is also picked up in the National Model Design Code. And then the last of them is the theme of nature, and chapter 15 of the MPPF, conserving and enhancing the natural environment. And here we have the policy presumption in favour of tree-lined streets, in the context of asking for more greenery. But I don't think anyone can criticise a street being tree-lined, although that may prove challenging for developers in certain areas. Moving on, we've got a nice picture of the National Model Design Code, and this has been published to pick up further of the key themes from the Living with Beauty report, focusing really on planning and community engagement. So it's been published to supplement the National Design Guide, which wasn't a document I was particularly familiar with until I started sort of looking into the suite of changes more closely. And we now have an expectation that local authorities will be producing their own local design guides and codes. How that comes through locally and how local expectations will be reflected is interesting, and may well rely on digital engagement, which is something that was just words probably a year ago, but now a year on from all being forced to work from home and not travelling and not meeting each other in person, digital engagement has been absolutely key, and we have now a sort of a workable understanding of what digital engagement might mean to take that concept forwards, I think. And that works for local authorities and developers alike, who these days will run many more of their consultations for major development schemes online and with a website to explain all the proposals. And I think it does encourage people to come forward because they don't have to take time out of their day to go to a physical place to inspect the documents, and they can do it in the evenings from the comfort of their living rooms, even if they are working people who are otherwise engaged by day. Otherwise, the people engaged in the planning process are those that have the time during working hours. So I hope that'll be a really positive change that the NMDC will help to take forwards. The provably popular form-based codes I think is interesting because the key aim here is to help understand and influence the development that might come forward, and for the community to understand why what is being proposed could be a good thing for their area. Ultimately, it comes down, all of these changes are to support the government's intention and stated policy aim of delivering 300,000 new houses a year, and they can't do that if local communities aren't on board, and this is a way to get them on board from the start. I'll whiz through some of these changes, but the first of which is important because beauty then can be defined to a certain degree by local communities based on what they want to see in their area. So we have that objective or subjective concept of beauty being sort of narrowed down through a design code into forms and design patterns that a local authority and local community have worked together to see as acceptable. And then picking up again, public engagement is going to be a central role in the planning process. And if that can happen, that would represent a major change and stop the planning system being so backward looking. I think it's bringing forward democracy is the theme of public engagement. Just flicking on to the access to greenery, more green spaces, more street trees, all of this is to be welcomed, and I think all of us will understand, having worked and lived at home for a year, how embedding this sort of design requirement through guidance and ultimately into policy at this stage should be welcome to give everybody that access to green space. It's very I just wanted to pick up on policy proposition 34 there, promoting planning excellence and the introduction of the interim office for place. I think one of the questions that is at the forefront of all of our minds, lawyers and local authorities and developers alike, is how will this come about? How will a local authority be able to interpret the National Model Design Code and start to be able to work up a meaningful local design code? So there we are, we've got 20 communities who are going to be piloted through the process when it goes live in the course of the next year, and with a view to creating an expert design body that will then empower all local communities to do better design engagement and placemaking. And I think that is going to be key to the success of these proposed reforms. So what happens next? I think we may hit a little bit of a hiatus because when the changes, if they're taken forward as proposed to the National Planning Policy Framework, come into effect, immediately all local authorities are tasked with preparing these design codes. And so the question must be asked is, do they have enough support, and who will be supporting them? The interim office for place can't support everybody. We know they've identified 20, but I'm not quite sure how many hundreds of local planning authorities there are out there that will be looking for support. And it also raises questions of resourcing. Invariably, some local authorities will be quicker off the mark than others, and others may well be left behind. And that raises a question for what happens to development in their area during that period. And then there's the question of how successful the community engagement is. It would seem logical to say that the more successful the community engagement, the clearer the expectations and understandings of the sort of development that that area wants will be, and therefore hopefully the easier it will be for developers to bring forward development to meet those expectations. So there we are, we have that positive cycle that Nicholas identified. But that's a utopian world, and there's a lot of ground to cover to get there. Also coming into effect when the changes take effect is this concept that development that is not well designed should be refused. Now that's put in much more strong terms than it was previously in the MPPF. And we've also got the very interesting statement that conversely, significant weight should be given to development which reflects local design policies and government guidance on design. Now, if that goes live at day one and people are making decisions with that policy in effect, there could be a risk of legal challenge, because the playing field won't be level on day one, and there don't appear to be any transitional provisions proposed by the government that explain what might happen while local authorities are gearing up and trying to understand and work with local communities to bring this much forward. We have the National Model Design Code, which, as the government states, has the force of planning policy guidance and should be relied upon in the absence of local design policies having been introduced. However, how that will be applied in practice when people are making planning decisions obviously remains to be seen. And the other issue I wondered about was whether there would be any support for developers out there, because the whole system only works if people actually make planning applications. And so the local authorities can be supported to make these design codes, but how does a developer respond, for example, when preparing a major planning application for a garden village or a new settlement? The white paper says something about that, and I believe Charlie will touch on that. But sort of in the here and now, when these changes come into effect, what support is there for developers, and who should they look for to sort of quality check their planning applications? And we come on to the law. It's worth just reminding ourselves where all these policy and guidance changes sit. As everyone will know, planning decisions need to be made in accordance with the development plan. The development plan is key, and the development plan sets out planning policies for a particular area unless material considerations indicate otherwise, and that's enshrined in sections 38.6 and section 72. The MPPF is just a material consideration. It is not part of the statutory scheme, and that's been reinforced in a recent case, the Gladman case from February this year. And I think that's a very important point to remember at this stage. The beauty and placemaking reforms that the Living for Beauty report promoted are only policy. There is a vision to make them law in due course, and again, I'm looking to we'll look to see what the government says in response to its consultation on the white paper. But for now, they only have force as policy. And it is, case law has said, it's important not to overstate the scope of the MPPF. It does not and cannot displace the primacy of the development plan. That was the Supreme Court case in Richborough Estates and Hopkins Homes. And then, going back a bit further, policy must be interpreted objectively. It is for the decision maker to interpret what policy means, unless that interpretation is irrational or perverse. And therefore, there is quite a degree of latitude afforded, as you would expect, to the planning professionals and local authorities to arrive at the decision on a planning case. But when you layer over that sort of local government and committees, I've just seen Iain pick up. It points to decision making not being taken in a consistent manner across the country, and so these reforms may not be consistently applied. It may become easier to develop in Devon than it does in Dorset, depending on how the local authority has taken things forward. And a quick reminder about the role of planning practice guidance, which is mustn't be interpreted in an overly legalistic way, and there is the case of solo retail and Torridge. Couple of quick looks at other important considerations. I thought it was worth flagging up this issue of Article 4 directions. It's been much talked about, and it slightly contradicts what was set out in the Living with Beauty report, which very much recommended the protection of core high streets. but the government's response, and I've set it out in full, paragraph 53, limits the ability to use Article 4 directions to remove national permitted development rights, which, as you know, there's been a suite of changes to through the introduction of Class E and further changes proposed where Class E could become residential, and to limit the application of those Article 4 directions to where they are essential to avoid wholly unacceptable adverse impacts. So if these policy propositions are adopted in full, this will heavily curtail the ability of local authorities to control the use of permitted development in their area, even on core high streets. Sorry, Iain. I'm winding up.
Final slide, yeah.
Final slide. Written ministerial statements. I think there's one other really important change to flag, which is snuck in at the bottom of paragraph 35D, and it says that decision making should be consistent with national policy in accordance with the policies in this framework and other statements of national planning policy where relevant. And the importance of that is that takes us from having just the national planning policy framework to look at, to understand where policy lies, to potentially opening the door to other policies published by the government, such as written ministerial statements. And there's a fairly wide latitude on what those can say as statements of the government at the time. And there's a nice little case that dealt with that in the Court of Appeal a few years ago. It's the Secretary of State against West Berkshire and Reading District Councils. So I think just watch for planning by the back door. The NPPF was heralded as 1,300 pages of policy to 65, but are we then going to be looking outside the scope of the NPPF to work out what other statements of national policy are relevant? I'll skip over stewardship. All it's to say is that's still to come. I think this is for the law rather than for policy, and the government response is there. And then very briefly, in summary, we have beauty on a policy footing. It's not an objective concept, but it could be made more objective if local authorities feel able to convert the policy and guidance into workable and popular design codes and properly informed by community engagement. It can't be, and I assume it's not intended to be rolled out consistently across the country, because what is local and what is preferred locally is important. And will this really create a level playing field for all planning applications? We don't have a defined transitional period to the NPPF reforms, so there may be appeals and legal challenges as the changes bed in, and that will be borne out between the tension between achieving beauty and housing delivery and the numbers required. And a little thought from Coco Chanel to end. Thank you.
Thank you, Claire, very much. A couple of just quick housekeeping points before Charlie takes over. I think time is slightly against us, but I'm really keen for Charlie to deliver his points properly. So if you're able to stay until kind of 11:10, that will give Charlie 5 or 10 minutes to answer to make his points, and then we'll still give us some time for questions. If you're not able to stay, I'm not talking to you, Charlie. If you're not able to stay, there will be a recording made available of today's session, and I think we can probably distribute slides as well. So if you have to disappear at 11, you won't miss out. And apologies that we're slightly overrunning. Charlie, over to you.
Thanks, Iain. How can I follow Coco Chanel? Well, I'll do my best. Good morning, everybody. I'm going to focus, as has been said, on the future world envisaged by the Planning for the Future White Paper and how the Building Beautiful agenda might play out in practice in that world. Now, we're, of course, still waiting the government's response to the consultation on the White Paper, but I think it's fair to say that anyone who watched Chris Pincher's interview on Have We Got Planning News for You, or anyone who's seen the various ministry advertisements for new staff to implement the new regime, will be in little doubt that the bulk of the White Paper proposals are likely to be taken forward. I should say at the outset that, if only for Nicholas's benefit, as someone who's on the White Paper steering committee, I quite like many of the White Paper proposals. I'm quite a fan of them, although, as many have said, the devil's going to be in the detail, and in outlining their potential operation and implications of Building Beautiful today, I hope to highlight a few areas where particular thought needs to be given to that detail. With that introduction, I'm turned first of all to the new local plan regime, and in particular the local design code regime. I'll assume that you're all familiar with the basic thrust of the white paper in relation to plan making. The key elements for today's purposes are, firstly, new style local plans to annotate land in one of three categories: growth, which has outline permission; renew and protect; generic development plan policies that simply repeat national policy in local plans is to be done away with. And in their place, there will be local design guides and codes, and I'm quoting now from the white paper, to provide certainty and reflect local character and preferences about the form and appearance of development. And we're told that these design codes would either be provided on a twin track with the local plan and be adopted as part of it or alongside it, or alternatively prepared as supplementary planning documents. Now, that first point is an important distinction, because if they're prepared as part of the plan, then, as Claire's just outlined, they would carry the force of the development plan, which has statutory primacy, unlike a supplementary planning document, which by definition is only a material consideration. I think it's also important to note that local plans are subject to examination for soundness, unlike SPD, so there's more rigour in the process. It seems to me to be preferable if design codes form part of or accompany the local plan. An immediate point that all this throws up is resources. Many, possibly the majority of local planning authorities these days, don't have in-house design expertise. Contrast that to the position historically, where there are lots of references to old planning permissions and the documents related to them as to the local authority's architect. Well, that concept doesn't really exist very much now. The white paper makes great play on the streamlining of the development control system, meaning that local authority resources will be freed up and officers can repurpose their skills. But it's one thing, I think, for a development control planner to repurpose into plan making, but quite another for them to repurpose as an urban designer, which is a completely different professional discipline. Now, the Office of Place will, of course, be there to assist local authorities, but there will still need to be adequate in-house expertise to prepare and indeed then monitor and regulate the local design codes. And I think, therefore, the operation in practice and indeed the success of the proposals will depend to a considerable degree on what local authorities are provided with or enabled to obtain in terms of resources. Now, next point, we're still awaiting DEFRA's consultation on the future of environmental assessment. But it's worth flagging up that any amendments to the SEA, Strategic Environmental Assessment, Sustainability Appraisal Regime, will need to be alive to the possibility, or maybe is that even a probability, that on the current wording of the SEA legislation, it's at least arguable that local design codes would be what lawyers call a framework setting plan or programme, which will be subject to the need for SEA. I'm not sure that's the intention. It may be worth government looking at that. Now, a word, if I may, though I'm only a mere lawyer, on the content of local design codes. Now, in my purely anecdotal experience, planners and indeed inspectors often tend to take what I would call a sort of uniformist approach to urban design, by which I mean within a particular street or area, it's seen as desirable for the buildings to be the same style, same height, same materials, etc. And obviously sometimes that's appropriate, but not always. And I very much hope that what local design codes don't become is some kind of straitjacket. It seems to me that building beautiful should be an enabling concept, not a constraining concept. And by way of example, two of my favourite cities in the world are San Francisco and New Orleans, and not just for their nightlife, but actually for their architecture. Anyone amongst you who's wandered around the streets of those cities will appreciate that the variety of buildings within the same streetscapes is a defining feature. And I think it's important for the Office for Place to ensure that the scope for variety, where beneficial, is captured in LBCs, and we don't end up with monotony. Now, that brings me neatly on to custom and self-build. Now, that by definition is individualistic. How is this to fit in within the new regime? I ask this rhetorically, as I'm not really sure what the answer is. The white paper is silent on how they will fit into local design coding, but given the increasing policy and legal impetus behind self and custom build, it seems to me to be important that the local design coding regime doesn't either overlook them or impose undue constraint on individual and innovative design. Another point, which is unclear to me at the moment, is what's the position going to be in conservation areas? Paragraph 2.8 of the white paper indicates that conservation areas wouldn't be annotated as growth or renewal areas, but as protect areas. So it may be that different principles apply there, whether local design codes don't apply or whether they apply with certain qualifications. If they are to apply in conservation areas, then obviously it would be prudent to ensure that they have appropriate heritage input. And if they don't apply in conservation areas, that's quite a broad exclusion, given the extent of conservation area coverage. Most of the local authority area I live in is in various conservation areas. And finally, it's worth noting that the bulk of the white paper's focus, and indeed the focus of the discussion about it generally, is on new housing development. That's not surprising. But clearly, local design codes have a role to play in relation to other forms of development, and maybe particularly those forms where historically it's been said that the design has been necessarily somewhat utilitarian, whether that might be large warehouse type infrastructure, even things like care homes. It's often said they have to be a bit box-like. Maybe the local design codes can test those assumptions a little bit and explore if it's possible to build those kinds of developments more beautiful too. I move on now to neighbourhood plans. In the past, neighbourhood plans have all too often been as much about blocking development in reality as they have been about enabling development, for example, by stealing a march on local authorities' local plans and setting neighbourhood-specific housing targets, which are less than the neighbourhood authorities' fair share of the district-wide objective needs. Now, there are signs in the white paper that there may be a repurposing of neighbourhood plans to focus more on how development should come forward, including adapting the neighbourhood plan concept, so we're told, and I'm quoting again, so that very small areas such as individual streets can set their own rules for the form of development which they're happy to see. Now, again, the devil's going to be in the detail. Will this be enabling, or will this result in de facto conservation areas being introduced by the back door via neighbourhood plans? Well, I hope it's very much the former. It could be quite exciting and invigorating the planning system. Watch this space. Fast track for beauty. Now, what the white paper says in this respect is as follows. Now, in growth areas, a condition of the outline planning permission granted via the local plan allocation will require that a master plan and a site-specific design code are submitted to and agreed to inform the reserve matters. And the reserve matters then will come forward pursuant to that code. In renewal areas, it's proposed that the fast track for beauty would widen the scope of permitted development so as to enable development to proceed, subject to what's said to be pre-approvable of popular and replicable designs. Now, it's important to note that the white paper goes on to say that this would apply to the redevelopment of existing buildings, not, it seems, development of vacant or unbuilt land. And it seems that the intention is to provide an incentive to bring existing built land in line with popular and appropriate local designs, thereby raising the bar of design quality in urban areas. And certainly if it can replace the residential conversion PD rights, so that the type of situation Nicholas mentioned, indeed showed happen in Watford, can't happen again, that would clearly be a considerable improvement. Now, the same paragraph of the white paper indicates that prior approval will still be needed, quote, for other important planning considerations. And it's going to be significant to see what they are. If they reflect last year's permitted development liberalisation, then the considerations may very well include matters such as impact on amenity, transport, traffic, noise, light, many of which are amongst the common grounds of objection to planning applications in residential urban areas anyway. So I think it's going to be important to calibrate that right so that effectively all the same sorts of things that hold up planning applications don't hold up the PD applications. Otherwise, it's not really a liberalisation in anything but name. It's important to note that these PD rights are expressed to apply in renewal areas, which would mean they wouldn't apply in conservation areas. And finally, a point to note again about resources. I think it's really important to appreciate the implications for local authorities of widening the scope for PD rights. The fees are very considerably smaller. And for anybody wondering what planning fees are spent on and why this point is important, I commend to you the interview that the excellent Stephen Hunt, Head of Planning at East Riding of Yorkshire Council, gave on Have We Got Planning News for You about a month ago, which is available on YouTube, where he explains what the money is spent on and why it's important and why taking the hit by things being converted to PD applications has real implications for local authorities' planning practices. So it's going to be important to make sure that the money comes from somewhere. couple of final points. New settlements. The white paper envisages these could in future be via the DCO process for national significant infrastructure projects. I think that's a really good idea, personally. What's less clear is, would they be then subject to local design codes, or would they be required to formulate their own design codes? It would seem to me that, given that by definition most new settlements are a blank slate, effectively what would be required would be for the DCO itself to bake in a requirement for a local design code, or perhaps even some outline coding itself. Also, I think a national policy statement for new settlements, if they do become capable of being NSIPs, would be a valuable means of providing clarity on this and on new settlement principles generally. Finally, transitional arrangements. How are these new principles going to apply to the future reserve matters of large multi-phase developments, which are consented, at least in outline, before the new regime comes in? I mean, where design is a reserve matter, as it would be for large schemes, then the local design codes would presumably apply to reserve matters. But what if this involves, for example, additional costs not factored into the viability assessment for the outline? And how do you stitch together, for example, phases 1 and 2, which had, say, obtained reserve matters before the local design code regime comes into place and are being built out in the, should we call it diplomatically, the conventional way, and phases 3 and 4, which obtain reserve matters approval after the local design code comes in? How do you then stitch together those phases to create a seamless, well-integrated development? Those are not insurmountable challenges, but they're important things that are going to have to be thought through. Those are my thoughts, and back to you, Iain.
Wow, Charlie, thank you very much. That was, if I might say, protein-packed and very fast and furious. Thank you very much. Fantastic. Loads of points in there. Lots of food for thought, and we're all going to be waiting to see what comes out of the consultation and the government's response to it over the next few months. We've had a number of questions. We're going to take perhaps just 3 or 4 minutes now to try and answer some of those, not all of them, I'm afraid. Just to confirm that the slides and the recording will be available and will be sent out to everybody who registered for today, and will be available on the Keating Chambers and Pinsent Mason's website. So if you have to disappear now, you can catch up later. So 3 or 4 questions I just wanted to put to the panel. They're all good questions. Ruben Bellamy, hello Ruben. House builders often cite the fact that they sell dwellings and that their customers fill in questionnaires saying that they like their new homes as evidence that they are well designed. Is that a valid point, Nicholas Boyce Smith?
I thought that might come to me. Thank you, and thank you, Claire and Charlie, for fantastic talks. Well, it's fair up to a point. Look at the polling, looking at the pricing data, I think is what this comes to. So if you look at the polling data and what people say they want to live in, everyone wants to live in a detached house. If you look at the pricing data, actually they make trade-offs in terms of the quality of the place and its proximity to other things. And actually a well-designed traditional town centre or near town centre is actually something people will pay far more for. And then if you look at the pricing data of new build versus existing settlements, and we, Create Streets, did an analysis of every single sale in 6 British cities, I think 3 years ago data, now 4 years ago. The new build premium in most of those places is a fraction of the high quality place premium. So I think actually place brings more value than the new build ultimately. And 2, and I don't say this to beat up on the volume house builders, but it's not that far off an oligopoly. Perhaps I think it is an oligopoly because they are such a high proportion of the new build volume. There isn't anywhere else to go. They are competing on access to land rather than quality. There was a poll done a few years ago that said, I forget, I think it was 3/4, 2/3 of people say they'd rather live in an old house than a new house. Now, at one level, that's ridiculous. There's no other bit of the mixed market economy other than the antiques market where that would be true. We should be building better homes in better places, surely, than we did 50, 100, 200 years ago. But in some way, we're not. And it is always striking. I was on a call of senior officials and planners the other day. How many of them seem to be living in old buildings? So, I don't think the pricing data actually ultimately bears that out. So I think the volume house builders are actually ultimately wrong on that.
Thank you, Nicholas. And yeah, it's anecdotally, the number of calls I've been on over the last few months where many of the participants are sitting in timbered buildings is extraordinary. Actually, I won't ask you for how old your houses are, but I suspect that they've not been built in the last 10 years.
1825.
Well, there we are. An anonymous question, Clare. A disconnect between government pushing the most efficient use of land, intensification of brownfield sites, etc., and the gentle density approach. These would appear to be at odds with each other, and it's not clear how these can be reconciled. Is design coding and objectively assessing quality and beauty, is that going to help with that challenge?
I sort of don't see why it shouldn't, is my my first thought to that, because if design is to be reflected, it should be reflected in all types of development. However, obviously it's more expensive to develop brownfield sites, and therefore the money that is needed to bring forward a development on that of that nature may find itself sort of struck by viability concerns when it's also trying to be beautiful as well. And I think there's going to be a bit of a tension between how you get a brownfield development going that's also beautiful, when you could have the alternative of an easier greenfield site where you're starting afresh.
Thank you, Clare.
Can I add just a very quick non-technical point?
Yeah,
just 30 seconds. So,
yeah.
I mean, for me, because we make it so hard to build and have such a difficult planning system, so much public opposition to new development, we're reliant on a small number of sites where the density gets maximised. If we can systemically, and this is not something you do overnight, if we can systemically change public attitudes, and it will take many years and over a generation, to new development, so it's not something most of us automatically worry about and oppose, so we're able to develop gently in far more places, and in principle, it won't happen overnight, the pressure for mega overdevelopment and super density in a small number of sites should reduce. I agree that won't happen straight away.
And a sort of not unrelated question that Julian Cooper asked halfway through our session today, Nicholas, was trying to avoid a push towards pastiche traditional design when modern design can be of equal quality. There's a sort of sense that if you're a developer, you're going to go for what the market understands and likes and is comfortable with, and you're not going to push the boundaries of modern design. Are we going to end up with pastiche street scenes throughout England?
Well, I mean, developers should build what people want to live in, I think is point one. So, at one level, I don't care. People should developers and landowners should build where people want to live. And I'm genuinely ambivalent as to whether that's pastiche, to use the word, or whether it's modern. I don't mind. So they should do what people want, point one. Point two would be that, and I tried, though probably perhaps inadequately, to set this out briefly in my talk earlier, the types of form that tend to be aligned with more popular places in which people seem to be happier and seem on the data to engage in more pro-social behaviour are not necessarily pastiche or modern. They are certain elements of urban form, and you can actually enumerate them. Enclosure ratios, how easy it is to walk, presence of little and often greenery as opposed to relying on a large bit of greenery over there, some level of coherent complexity. So as you get closer to a facade pattern, as you step away, it resolves itself into something that seems composed and comprehensible to the brain. But as you get closer, actually, there's a level of texture and detail that we enjoy. These are pretty consistent, I would argue almost ubiquitous in the data. You can do that in a traditional way, and you can do it in a less traditional way. I think traditional has a sort of built-in advantage in that for most of us, all of us in different ways, place is psychological. It is not something we're purely logical about, nor should it be. If you think about it, home should be an emotional thing. If we've got memories there, the street we grew up on, the street this happened to us, it might be good memory, it might be bad memory, that will imbue it with a level of emotion. And so there's always going to be probably a slightly backward-looking trend for most of us psychologically in what we find homely. You don't like that if you don't, but nevertheless, I think it is pretty common to most people. So there you go. I hope that's an answer. It may not be, but that's the best I can do.
No, it's a great answer. And the emotional attachment to home is so important to all of us at the moment, I think. Charlie, an unfair question to ask you, but I'm going to ask you anyway to finish with. This is a Mr. Hawkey, who is a planner, apparently. Anyway, he's I think hoping that this debate will invigorate British architects and will encourage them to do more architecture in the UK rather than going off and getting exciting projects abroad going. Do you see this as being a call to arms for the British architectural profession to actually focus on what's going on in this country?
It's a characteristic great point from Nigel. I think the answer is yes. I mean, there's probably been a sort of vicious circle, hasn't there, that all the sort of great architects have been driven away because there's not very much interesting stuff to do on our own shores apart from fancy things like Heathrow Terminal 5. And so, yes, I think it's probably quite a good point. If it's going to succeed, the vision, then it's going to require the architectural profession to step up and deliver the vision. So yes, I agree.
Fantastic, Charlie. That's a great point to finish on. I'm sorry we haven't been able to take all the questions, but I'm sure there'll be an opportunity to follow up. It just remains for me to thank Nicholas, Claire and Charlie for your very erudite and considered papers today. Thank you to the audience for joining, and we look forward to seeing you all again very soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Iain. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Iain. Thank you, everyone.